Welcome to Unit 5, Lesson 3. We are moving now into the last chapter we're going to study in AP Microeconomics, which is about labor markets and how it is, what we're going to investigate in this chapter is how is it that firms make their decisions of how many workers to hire and what wage to pay them. We're going to, like we did with perfect competition, set up a really simplified scenario and try to draw from that some things about the way the firms behave and choices they make that we can also apply to more realistic scenarios too. But I will also say that the scenarios that we're going to talk about here with labor markets or with what are called perfectly competitive labor markets are actually more applicable, probably more close to reality for a number of industries compared to what we talked about with perfectly competitive firms. Remember we said that few firms meet the requirements of perfectly competitive firms, but in this chapter, we're going to see what's called a perfectly competitive labor market, and there are quite a few firms that approach this kind of situation. So we're going to first define what we mean by a perfectly competitive labor market. And the example given in our book is a wheat, the market for wheat workers who would work the fields to harvest the wheat. So we need to assume for a labor market we're talking about one kind of labor, not necessarily one kind of company or firm, but one kind of labor. And then we're going to break it out into the market and to individual firms. So to have a perfectly competitive labor market, here are the requirements. Each firm needs to be a small part of the entire labor market. And when you think about it, most firms meet this requirement. For instance, so let's take fast food. Even though fast food itself is not perfectly competitive, the market for fast food workers is probably perfectly competitive or approaches it because there are so many workers out there in the entire market of jobs for fast food labor. And each fast food firm is a very small part of it. And if you're a worker, there's not much differentiation about whether you rather work for one firm or another. You're going to do the work similarly no matter where you are. So for a perfectly competitive labor market, one requirement is each firm needs to be a very small part of the entire market. The opposite of this, what's different if you go down to an imperfectly competitive labor market, is what's called monopsony. If there's only one firm in a given region hiring for a given market, then that's not a small part of the entire labor market. That's what's called a monopsony situation. So an example here in town in Indianapolis would be research chemists. Let's say, and it's probably not the case, but let's say that Lilly is the only place where a research chemist with a PhD could get employment. Let's say that's true. Well, that's not a perfectly competitive labor market because Lilly is the entire hirer, is the only hirer in that labor market. But in a perfectly competitive labor market, that's not the case. Each firm is just a small part of it. For that reason, each firm needs to take the market wage. So when we say the firm is a wage taker, they're going to pay all their workers what's called the market wage, the same wage, which is set by a market, as you would probably guess, of supply and demand for workers, which we'll get to. And then lastly, for a perfectly competitive labor market, we're going to assume that there's also a perfectly competitive product market. In other words, a market for the firm's products, such as, so for wheat, again, for farming, I'm going to say e.g., for example, farming. Remember we said farming, small farmers approach perfectly competitive situations. And that's important because we have to assume that the price of the good stays the same no matter how much they produce for our simple analysis here. So the main two things to know about what makes a perfectly competitive labor market are this. Each firm is a very small part of it, and therefore they are wage takers. They're going to pay all their workers a market wage, and they don't have to raise the wage to get more workers, which, if you go back down to the bottom one, the imperfectly competitive ones. If you're Eli Lilly, if you want to hire more workers than you have right now, assuming there's not a whole lot of research chemists out there looking for work in Indianapolis, you've got to increase the wage to draw more people in to work from out of town or over the long haul to get more people to become research chemists in the very long run. So anyway, there's the definition of a perfectly competitive labor market. Next we go to the market for labor in a perfectly competitive market. This is going to be a distinction again between the market and the firm, but here's the look of the market for labor. Here's the market labor supply, which we've done this before. Remember when we did the minimum wage study? We said the supply of labor comes from workers looking to work. And And we'll analyze the supply of labor and where it comes from and why it's shaped the way it is a little bit later in the chapter. But for now, just know that we've got an upward sloping supply curve. Sometimes this is just labeled SL for supply of labor. And then the demand for labor, here's the market labor demand curve. The demanders of labor in a market are the firms looking to hire. So it's a little bit flipped from how we usually see it in supply and demand. Usually the suppliers are the firms and the demanders are the consumers. Well, in a labor market, the suppliers are the workers. They're supplying their labor, their skills, their work, and the firms are demanding them. The firms want resources, workers, to be able to work with the other resources they have, capital resources and whatnot, to create their products. So then in a labor market, you'll have on the x-axis quantity of labor, quantity of workers, and on the y-axis you'll have the wage. It's just another price, but it's the price of labor is called the wage. So we just call it a W for wage. And the equilibrium of supply and demand for workers creates the market wage. This W, I call that market wage, which becomes the wage that firms take. So for now, let's just take that as a given, because we're going to come back and explain where the supply and demand for labor comes from in the market a little bit later. But for now, just assume, okay, the market wage is going to come from this market equilibrium of supply and demand for labor. And then each firm is going to take that market wage as the wage that they need to pay their workers. And we're going to call this the marginal resource cost. It's the cost of this resource. It's the cost of the workers. Again, on the x-axis, we'll have quantity of workers. And each additional worker costs you an additional amount that is equal to the market wage. So the marginal resource cost, or MRC, is a horizontal line at that market wage, which comes from that market equilibrium. So the firm needs to look at this and say, okay, so it costs us, let's put a number on this. Let's say this is $10 an hour. If it costs us $10 an hour to hire workers, how many workers should we hire? So to answer that question, the main thing you probably guess we need to know is, well, how much value are the workers going to produce for us? Are they going to produce at least $10? If another worker is going to produce more than $10 of additional profits, additional revenue, probably is a better way of putting it, then the worker is going to be worth hiring. But if not, then we shouldn't hire them. So where does that come from? And so here's where we get into what's behind the demand for labor for the firm. So we need to know two main things to get to where we can calculate the demand for labor. One is the price of the product. Labor is sometimes referred to as derived demand. The demand for labor is a derived demand, which comes from the idea that the demand for labor is derived from the demand for the good that the labor is producing. We don't have demand for wheat workers unless we have demand for wheat. So the price of the wheat is an important thing here. And the other piece that's important is the productivity of the workers. How much does each additional worker produce? And I circled that and wrote MPL, but MPL stands for marginal product of labor. And our book abbreviates this MPL. We've seen it before as simply the marginal product. But it adds this L to specify this the marginal product of each additional worker. And we get this, we know how to do this. We have, right here we have a production function. Remember this? It gives us quantity of workers, and for each additional worker, how much does that add to our total output of wheat? And then the marginal product of labor is what's the additional output that each additional worker creates. So we're familiar with all that. Hopefully that's all easy and review. Here's the new concept that we add in when we're dealing with labor markets, the concept of what's called the value of the marginal product of labor, VMPL, stands for the value of the marginal product of labor. And if all these acronyms weren't confusing enough, unfortunately the AP test uses a different acronym for this than our book does. So here's what the AP test calls this. Synonym for the VMPL is also the marginal revenue product. I like our book's term better, personally, but you need to get familiar with this acronym MRP because that's what the AP test uses. So basically both these things mean the same thing. Okay, so how do we get that? If we take the marginal product of labor and multiply it by the price of the good, remember it's $20 is the price of wheat, and each time that we add more units of output, we're multiplying by an additional $20 because we're multiplying by $20, I should say, to get the value of the marginal product of labor. What do those numbers mean? Well, what we're saying here is this first worker produces 19 units of output. That's what the marginal product of labor tells us. We can sell those 19 units for $20 each, which means this first worker is gaining for us $380 of revenue. That's where this term comes from, the marginal revenue product. That's why the word revenue is in there. And when we say the value of the marginal product of labor, we're trying to say what's the dollar value that this additional product gets for us. Or if you want to say it another way, which is slightly dehumanizing, we would say, what's this worker worth? This worker is worth $380 in revenue. It's not a very good thing to say from a Christian standpoint. In any case, the value of the marginal product of labor tells us another thing that's very important, which is how much should this firm be willing to pay this worker to come work for them. Because remember, going back up to this wage. We said the wage is $10. We said how much we'll hire these workers if they get us at least $10 additional dollars. And this tells us how much we're getting out of each of these workers. So in our book, they give a daily market wage. So let's switch the wage rate. If $200 is equal to the market wage rate, not $10, so this is for the day, then how many workers should the firm hire? Basically, they should keep hiring until this value of the marginal product of labor falls below $200. So they should stop there. They should hire 5 workers. They should keep hiring workers as long as each worker is bringing in more than they're costing in wages. So 5 would be the profit maximizing quantity of labor to hire. And we could show that on a graph with a nice normal looking labor demand curve, which is basically a graph of this VMPL data. So the VMPL is equal to the demand for labor from the firm. So basically this is just a graph of the quantity of workers along with the value of their marginal product. And then if we go across here, sometimes you'll see this is a solid line. This we could call the supply of labor for the firm, or we could call it that marginal resource cost, as I mentioned above. And the equilibrium there, the intersection of those two, gives us the profit maximizing number of workers. Those should cross at the 5th worker, showing that for each of these first 4 workers and up to the 5th, we're getting more value out of them than we're paying them. Whereas if you go beyond that to the 6th, 7th, and 8th, we're paying them more than they're producing for us in value. Okay, so that's how we build a simple labor demand curve for a perfectly competitive labor market. It's important that it's perfectly competitive because that keeps the wage constant all the way through. And it's also important that the market that we're working in is perfectly competitive because then the price stays the same all the way through. And that just makes this a nice, easy, simple calculation, as opposed to more complicated things, which we'll look at in a little bit after this, not in this lesson. Okay, so in class what we'll do are we'll be given data on the price of the good, on the wage rate, and on the production function. And given this information, how many workers should this firm hire? be able to draw a graph that shows what how the firm figures out the profit maximizing number of workers to hire, and then also relate that to the market wage. So last thing here, we'll take it all the way back to these graphs and say if now we add in on the firm graph the demand for labor, the firm's demand for labor, and then again we call this the firm's supply of labor, then we can show now the equilibrium profit maximizing quantity of workers to hire given this market wage and the firm's demand for labor, which comes from the price of the good and the productivity of the workers. Okay, there's our first part of the concept. We'll do a bunch of problems like this in class. See you then.